Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Stephen Barter. I have the privilege to be co-chair of the Global Advisory Board within the European, Middle East, and African region of the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And I'm very pleased my co-chair, Keith Breslauer, is also with us this morning. Now, I'm delighted to welcome you all to Chicago Booth's London campus. And a packed house early on a Friday morning shows there's great interest in our most distinguished guest speaker today, Governor Raghuram Rajan. Now, let me first ask, how many in the audience today are alumni of Chicago Booth? Excellent. Well, it's wonderful to see all of you back here. And how many of you are visiting the London campus for the first time? Well, you're also very welcome, and we hope this will be the first of many. Now, just a little introduction to the school, if I may. Chicago Booth is an integral part of the University of Chicago, a private research-based university with over 15,000 students, founded with a donation from John D. Rockefeller in 1890. Now, in a crowded and global business school field, Chicago Booth stands out for its insight, influence, and impact on the world. We're all reminded of that impact every time we walk past the photographs of the 89 Nobel laureates associated with the school, which hang on the wall outside the room here. Now, the London campus has been the school's European home since 2005. Each year, over 300 executives come from all over Europe and beyond to take our EMBA and non-degree programs, all taught directly by our renowned Chicago faculty. And besides campuses in Chicago and London, the school has a campus in Hong Kong and centers in Singapore and in Delhi. Asia, and particularly India, remain the homeland for many of our students and is, of course, the homeland for our guest speaker this morning. Now, Mark Twain famously wrote, "India is the cradle of the human race, the birthplace of human speech, the mother of history, the grandmother of legend, and the great-grandmother of tradition. Our most valuable and most instructive materials in the history of man are treasured up in India only." So India's perspective on itself and on the rest of the world has always been important to understand. And which better pair of eyes to help us consider this today than Raghuram Rajan, 23rd Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, appointed in 2013. And we also welcome him as a distinguished service professor of finance at Chicago Booth, albeit on leave. Central Banker of the Year award winner in 2014 and 2015, he is recognized as the man responsible for ushering into India a new era of fiscal responsibility, which has transformed that huge and populous country into the fastest growing major economy in the world. Now, Governor Rajan is also no stranger to the biggest international economic and financial questions. A passion for research-based thinking alongside teaching and writing have been the hallmarks of his success, helping him to become the youngest chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, a prescient observer in 2005 of the looming financial crisis, chief economic advisor in India's Ministry of Finance, and most recently, vice chairman of the Bank of International Settlement. Many publications, many prizes, boundless curiosity, energy, and enthusiasm. One senses that his future career promises much, much more. His wife, Radhika, is herself a member of the Chicago Booth family, where she is adjunct associate professor of behavioral science. So, on behalf of us all, I'm delighted to welcome Governor Rajan to be with us this morning, and I thank you, sir, most heartily for sparing the time to share your thoughts with this particular gathering of students. It means a lot to us. May I also introduce you to our moderator for this morning, Chris Giles. Chris has been economics editor of the Financial Times since 2004, based in London. He won the prestigious Wincott Award in 2014 and was Business Journalist of the Year in 2012. He is also a repeat winner of the Royal Statistical Society Prize for Excellence in Journalism. Before the FT, Chris was an economics correspondent at the BBC and an economist for the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Chris, you too are most welcome to our campus. So, Governor Rajan, We felt that Chris was ideally placed to guide your conversation with us this morning about India and the world economy. And with that, I leave you in Chris's capable hands. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I haven't actually told or asked Governor Rajan this, but I think there's something I need to say right at the beginning, which is there are certain questions you can ask central bank governors, like, what do you think of the Fed's policies, where you know that they can't answer because there's an unwritten rule among central bankers that they certainly don't criticize their brothers in other countries. But the unwritten deal I think we should have with Raghu here is that I won't ask those questions I know he can't answer, but on all the questions I know he can answer, they'll be very forthright and newsworthy, hopefully even. Raghu, you're coming up to nearly in your third year at the Reserve Bank of India. I mean, personally, how do you feel being a central bank governor? How different is it from academic life?
There's first the commonalities. I think in every such endeavor, you have to deal with smart people. It's all about getting people together, working. If you try doing everything yourself, it's not going to work. So you have to find ways to create teams and let them run. And really much of your task is setting direction for the team. If you're doing all the work yourself, you're not effective. And finding good people to take those teams on and lead them. So in that sense, there's a similarity between the work you do in organizations like the IMF, in academia. After all, in academia, you're trying to maximize not only your output, but the output of your colleagues. You're working with smart students who ask penetrating questions. You're trying to motivate them to learn. So, I mean, there are similarities there. Differences, there is a fair amount. I'd say one big difference, certainly between an industrial country central banker and an emerging market central banker, is our job is not just to operate the framework, but sometimes to create the framework, which means that you have to go out there, speak for the need for change, for reform, for creating the framework, and then once you have it created, actually run it. So for example, in India, one of the larger tasks has been to try and push the case for making controlling inflation the primary mandate of the central bank. And now we have an inflation-focused framework which has been enshrined in legislation. We also have a monetary policy committee which was just legislated last week. And so a lot of my time has been spent trying to make the case for why this is a good thing for the economy, and therefore it involves a lot more speaking out.
And when do you think you will see definitive results of the sort of new framework of monetary policy within India? It's always hard to, cause and effect is always difficult.
Well, I think once now that the framework is in place, it will have to be given some time to run. But I think we had started implementing aspects of the framework right off the bat. And you can see some of the effects in greater a greater anchoring of expectations for analysts who are the ones who spend a lot of time trying to understand what we're doing. And that has started filtering into public expectations also. And those are also getting a little more anchored at lower levels. So my guess is this is all work in progress. It never actually finishes, but it's good that we've made a big start.
You'd like another term?
That's a question I can't answer.
If I can move on then to the world economy, we'll come back to India later. How do you see, I mean, just in a broad sense, the International Monetary Fund, your former employer, essentially sees the world economy as quite fragile, quite mediocre at the moment. Growth in the world is actually quite normal for the past 40 years, although they see a huge number of risks on the horizon, ranging from debt in China, slowing growth in emerging markets, particular troubles in Brazil and Russia, and then a big productivity slowdown globally. How do you see the global situation?
So I think post-financial crisis, for some years, we could argue that we sort of understood that the slow growth was a consequence of the high leverage, the deleveraging process, etc. Now we're 8 years from the financial crisis, and can we still attribute the relatively slow growth to deleveraging? And I think increasingly we have to say, well, maybe there's something else that was going on before the crisis, accentuated by leverage, and that's coming into play now as additional leverage can't mask those underlying forces. What are they and how do they play out? I think that's something that we understand far less. I mean, clearly, aging, population aging in some countries has to be part of why we have relatively slow demand. But how that plays out into asset prices, interest rates, exchange rates, much harder to tell. For example, with Japan, we still haven't understood what the consequences of population aging have been, and how, what responsibility they have for the relatively slow growth in Japan. In fact, your colleague David Pilling made I think a very important argument, which was that with the Japanese labor force shrinking at 1 to 2% a year, perhaps the right metric, the right norm, or the right normal for Japan is not a recession hits when you get 0 GDP growth, but a recession should be anything below -2% GDP growth. So in other words, we haven't really fully understood what population aging does, and we haven't even changed our metrics to deal with that. But that's one possible culprit for the still slow growth. There are a couple of others which keep coming up. One is productivity, and there are so many explanations for the low productivity growth. I'm sure we can go into those if you will, but we don't understand that either. With all this technological innovation seemingly happening around us, not just the social media stuff, but biotechnology, energy, batteries, a whole lot of stuff going on. Why is it not? Why is all this not showing up in the numbers? That's certainly a very great puzzle. And the third aspect, and this again is hard to tell, what does this stagnant median wage, increasing inequality, partly as a function of technological progress, which on the one hand we claim we don't see, on the other hand we see very much in jobs and in wages, that also presumably has an effect on aggregate demand and investment. And so put all these three together, some combination of these, we can tell stories explaining why we have slow growth. But I don't think we have strong evidence to support any one explanation.
Just to push you on the productivity issue, what is you said you could tell stories about it. What's your favorite story? Why do you think we sort of hear a lot about technology but see absolutely nothing about it in the economic data?
So let me pick three and put equal weight on those. And I haven't done research on this stuff, so I don't know how much more to say about it. One is we don't measure quality very well. So products today are much better than products yesterday. Your car is so much better, so much more sophisticated today than your car yesterday. However, in terms of when we count GDP growth, we count cars, we don't make enough adjustment for the better quality that they are today. And so, we undercount in some sense GDP in that sense when we don't count quality. How does this show up in the numbers? Well, we all know what nominal GDP is, and we discount or deflate nominal GDP by the inflation rate to get real GDP. okay? But if your car today is better than your car yesterday, and we attribute a price to the car today, but we don't, in fact, acknowledge it's 1.1 or 1.2 times the car that you had yesterday, then we are, in a sense, attributing too much price inflation to cars. And so when we deflate nominal GDP growth, we deflate by too large a number, and we get too low a real GDP growth. Put differently, GDP that would be counted would be higher if we adjusted appropriately for quality. This is an argument that Marty Feldstein has been making. Second argument, that we undercount GDP today because of technological change. There used to be a line in Paul Samuelson's textbook, which I think can be politically adjusted for the times. It basically says, if a wealthy lady marries a chauffeur, GDP comes down. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Well, basically, only stuff that's monetized gets counted in GDP. Once the chauffeur is your husband and drives you to work without charging for it, it's no longer counted in GDP, right? And so there's a lot of unmonetized stuff which doesn't show up in the GDP numbers. Now, how does technological progress change this? Well, you used to go to the theater and watch a movie. You paid for that movie ticket, and there's an usher who had a job. There's a ticket clerk who had a job. Today, they're missing. Instead, you watch the movie, or you watch something better. In fact, the latest comedy on the net, and you don't pay for it, or you pay peanuts for it. So as a result, your life is better, your consumption of leisure is better, but it doesn't show up in the GDP numbers.
On that one, for example, that might well go the other way. That doesn't necessarily go in one direction, because we've seen over the past 30 years a huge increase in employment, and particularly as women have gone into the labour market, so they've been doing less informal work and more monetized work.
You're absolutely right. So we may have overstated GDP growth over that time, because these were people who were actually working, perhaps at home, perhaps on the farm, and now their work is being monetized as they go out into the labor force. The increment would be much smaller because somebody else is now doing the work that they were doing at home. That's true. And but in terms of measured numbers, why measured numbers are low today, this would be a reasonable explanation. A third explanation, which is there, which I think increasingly must have more weight, is what are the costs of a relatively low cost of capital? If you have a relatively low cost of capital in economies, it favors incumbents. And if in fact there is risk aversion and you don't want to put your money in new risks, it may in fact disfavor new entrants. And one of the things we've seen in the United States and elsewhere is the rate of new entry in businesses has been falling steadily over time. And one could argue that this is accentuated if less efficient firms are kept alive with a low cost of capital, because they have access and they benefit from the low cost of capital. But young firms don't come in because low cost of capital is incremented by a very high hurdle rate because of the risks. And so in a period where the risk-free is low, but risk is penalized a lot, you tend to favor the incumbents versus the outsiders. And so we may have too many inefficient firms in there, which may be part of the productivity story. A similar argument could be made for labor holding.
And I mean, one of the, this brings us on to policy, and in particular, what governments or the authorities can do about the rather disappointing global outlook, and also what central banks can do about it. I mean, another reason that's often cited, which you haven't cited, is that just simply there hasn't been enough stimulus in the world, that we should be, either through monetary policy or through other means, making sure that growth is faster. What do you think about that?
Well, I think stimulus is can be quite effective when there's a short period of substantial risk aversion. If the private sector won't invest, the public sector can invest over a short period so as to balance things out. My sense is if we still require stimulus, 8 years after a crisis, we have to ask ourselves, is that the real problem? I sort of have this image of stimulus as a bridge. As the economy goes down and there's an expectation it'll come up, stimulus is a bridge which sort of smooths over the growth rate of the economy and prevents damaging expectations from building up as you go down. But if in fact what goes down is going to take a really long time to come up, and your stimulus only covers half of the distance, there's a very real question: what happens if you can't stimulate beyond a point? Is the adjustment going to be severe and sharp at that point? And I think we need to ask that question because the room for stimulus, to my mind, is far less than people suggest. If your debt to GDP is over 100%, doing more fiscal stimulus at this point, you better have a pretty high rate of return in mind. Otherwise, you could well get into a situation where your younger and even middle-aged generations are thinking, this thing is not going to return enough given the stimulus, but I'm going to have to pay for it. So offsetting public spending is private saving. That's a potential, and similarly with monetary policy.
And what about monetary policy? That people would say that, well, of course, even if you've got interest rates at historic lows across the world, it can do more. In the end, you could just print money.
So this is really, I think, the stress that central bankers are being subject to. And not having the same problem, I can talk more generally about industrial country central bankers. My sense is that today many of them are being held up to the fact that they have to meet, at least have inflation above a certain lower bound. Many of them have inflation targets which have a range. And because of the disinflationary or sometimes even deflationary forces around the world, many of them are in danger of falling below that lower bound. And so the question that people keep asking is, until you're inside that range, you're failing on the job, because there's always a way you can pump up inflation. And that's the point you just made. You can always print money, right? Now, yes, you can, but printing money to generate inflation implies when you print it and give it to people, this is a more dignified term for this than helicopter drop, which is the other term, is helicopter drop, take it up, take all the piles of money, throw it out of the window, whoever gets it goes out and spends because it's their lucky day. The alternative description is monetary financing of the fiscal deficit. In other words, the government prints bonds, gives it to the central bank gives the government money which the government sends through checks to everybody and says, go spend. But we know that these kinds, I mean, for the public, it doesn't matter who financed it, where the money came from. All that matters is they get the check in the mail. We've seen that even in past situations where you sent a check in the mail to people, they didn't spend it fully. Many of them sometimes saved it when they were highly uncertain. So the question we have to ask is the advent of helicopter money going to result in everybody going out and spending as if there's no tomorrow when they get that check? Or are they going to ask, what kind of world are we in where the central bank prints money and throws it out of the window and we pick it up and spend? Is there something really wrong with the world? Maybe I should augment savings rather than spending it. We had the same argument when we said we'll fill the banks with reserves, and obviously when they're filled with reserves, they'll go out and lend. And what do? They accumulated reserves, they didn't lend. So why are we so sure that when you fill the streets with money, people will take that money out and go and spend? Well, yes, if you create the threat of a hyperinflation, yes, they'll go out and spend before others do. But I presume that any helicopter money is going to be responsible helicopter money, in which case, if you're not going to generate high rates of inflation, it's not clear to me that we know for sure. I'm not saying it can't work, I'm just saying that we sort of think of it as a fail-safe nuclear option, which they could always try if not everything else fails. And they've tried so many things which haven't really worked that well. It's not clear to me this one also has so much promise.
do you think the central banks, not in India, but around the world in industrial countries, are sort of out of ammunition or close to out of ammunition?
Well, what I will say is they cannot claim to be out of ammunition because immediately that would create the wrong kind of expectations. So there's always something up their sleeve.
If we turn, before I'm going to open it to the audience because I'm sure lots of people here will have lots of questions, but I just want to talk a little bit about the Indian economy first. Just in the last few days, inflation has risen and there have been some bad industrial production numbers, leading you to be accused of sort of generating maybe a stagflation type environment and things not going as well as they had been in your first 2.5 years. What's your response to that?
I think there's economic noise. I think it goes up and down. I think the point is to look through and to see whether all the pieces are coming into place. I do think we're at the beginning or maybe in the midst of a slow recovery. I think the signs of a little faster growth are there. Auto sales, for example, cement production and consumption. And a good, strong monsoon would sort of cap this process or accelerate this process of recovery. Obviously, it is a tentative recovery, which is why you see some adverse signs at the same time as you see some positive signs. Broadly, I think core inflation has been fairly sticky, a little higher than we would want, but it has been fairly sticky and hasn't moved up and down with these blips in inflation. I think we're sort of going to continue on the task of anchoring expectations, and I think the support of a good monsoon would both help growth and because of stronger expectations of food production, et cetera, would help. I mean, it's not, again, a clear one-to-one relationship between monsoon strength and food production and prices, but I think it would help. And let us see how it goes.
And how about the banking sector? Because you've got a bit of a problem of non-performing loans and past excess credit extension, and yet your central bank's policy of trying to force banks to have more provisions against loans, people are saying that this is actually creating the credit squeeze, which is creating the slowdown which you want to avoid.
One of the things, if you look at credit growth over the last year and a half, is the public sector banks had slowed tremendously in lending, even before the central bank really accelerated measures to disclose and rectify assets, put assets back on track. So the crunch, if you will, was already there as public sector banks worried about the quality of the balance sheet. Credit growth last year for the public sector banks was 6%. For the private banks is 20%. So that's clearly the public sector banks where the difficulties were, they were already slowing. My sense is that the cleanup will help essentially put these problems behind, will actually help them put a few of these projects back on track, which wasn't happening when they put Band-Aids on them. And I think as the economy picks up, the banks will be readier to fund that growth because of the cleanup. I think the history of any financial stress situation around the world has shown the longer you wait, hoping and praying that things get better, the worse things become. I think we have started tackling the problem in a serious way after we gave the banks the instruments to deal with it. That required some work first. But now they have the instruments, they can start dealing with it, and the Parliament just passed a bankruptcy code. It'll take probably a little while for it to be implemented through the various tribunals, etc. But that also gives a shadow of a bankruptcy court to allow the out-of-court resolution process to get a little stronger and better. So I'm hopeful this cleanup will happen on time and will create the necessary room that banks need to lend. Certainly, I think the banks are doing the right thing at this point.
What would you want to see in the next few months to make you more confident that this is working?
Well, we're already seeing heavily indebted companies selling assets. That was important because some of them were over-levered, couldn't manage the size of the asset portfolio they'd built up. Selling assets, paying down the debt, good thing. We're also seeing attempts to revive projects that were stuck. We're seeing a lot of dialogue on the creation of structures like bad banks or entities to lend into stress situations. And we're seeing a lot of interest from foreign funds who are interested in picking up stressed assets that they can try and work with. So I think the framework is largely in place for entities to be able to do that. This is a good time both for domestic entities that have a lot of cash as well as foreign entities who want to put investment dollars to work to try and find places they can enter and to help the restructuring of the economy.
Now, just to stand back a bit, what if you had to name 3 things that India and the Indian economy needs to secure its place as the world's fastest growing large economy? What were the 3 reforms that you would really like to see?
Well, one answer I've given to this is implementation, implementation, implementation. What we need to do is not has been laid out by an entity we call the Niti Aayog, by the Prime Minister in various speeches, by the Finance Minister. We know what we need to do. And now we have to actually make that happen. And as I said, things are slowly coming into place. Infrastructure investment is starting to pick up quite strongly on the road side. Railway side, the rate of railway line construction has doubled. I think on the power side, for the first time in post-independence history, we are near self-sufficiency in power. We have enough power generated for all the needs. Now we only have to make sure that it reaches everybody who wants power by cleaning up the distribution system. So all this is fairly straightforward stuff we need to do by implementing the ideas that have been in place. So at the Reserve Bank, for example, what we try and do is give a 6-month picture. Here's what we need to do over the next 6 months, and then constantly monitor to make sure that those things are in place by the time that we indicated. And I think if we do that more broadly, here's the plan, and we're going to deliver. The Prime Minister is fairly focused on making sure that elements of his program are in fact working, that people are putting the necessary actions into place, constantly monitoring. I think if across the board we do that, we will do fine.
And just before I open it up to the audience, I can't let you come to London without asking you a Brexit question. The people who want to leave you want Britain to leave the European Union, quite often cite India as a country with whom Britain would be certain to do a very rapid trade deal, and this would offset any lost trade we might have with the EU. How likely is that in a Brexit scenario?
Oh, so you asked me the Brexit question in a way that I should possibly be able to answer. Look, let me say on the Brexit question, I think what is really very interesting and energizing about watching the debate is that everybody's talking about it, that everybody's coming with their studies, their analysis. So I think you have enough people here talking about it, and you'll reach a good decision, whatever it is. So I don't want to add my 2 cents to that.
Do you find the economics you've seen, which has been very one-sided for the Remain camp from all the studies apart from one, is that convincing to you?
You're getting me in again. Let me say that, look, I think they're very responsible organizations doing these studies, but as with, with any economic study, I think ultimately it depends on whether the observers are driven by, pure economics, what does it mean eventually for my salary, my bottom line, or are they driven by other forces which we understand less, you know, various political attitudes, nationalism, and so on. And so I think this is a minefield. I don't want to. I have enough minefields to deal with. So let me.
So maybe the audience will create some more minefields for you to deal with. Open to questions. If you could say who you are and where you come from. Just to take a question right at the back, first of all. If you wait for the microphone, then everyone can hear.
Hi, my name is Gaurav Bhagi. I'm a EXP 19 alumni and had the privilege of attending one of your courses just before you took office as the governor. So my question is more related to India's growth in terms of the world economy. We talked about the impact of technology. So clearly, I think being from the technology industry, I think the amount of data that is there today is going to, you know, there will be some firms globally who get it right in terms of making intelligent decisions, management decisions based on the data. But when you look at India, being Indian myself and being familiar with the Indian economy, I think we have a strength in terms of our entrepreneurial ability, especially in terms of distribution. We can't possibly match a Chinese powerhouse on manufacturing, but our strength lies in distribution. How do you see technology impacting this, given that we're so entrepreneurial, or jugaad as they say in India? Do you think with getting the right technology in, we would be able to make that transition to actually leverage the technology to make sound management decisions?
Well, first, there are lots of exciting things happening on technology in India, and there are reasons why you know, a technological solution would be easier and better in India. One simple reason is we have almost in every situation an enormous population which depends on a particular service. So lowering transaction costs is extremely important, whether it's transaction costs of doing a medical operation or transaction costs of giving a loan. The amount people can pay is relatively small, but there are tons of people who want that service. And the only way you can make it affordable is through the use of technology. So I think across the board, we're seeing examples of this. As you know, in some of these medical hospitals, they've reduced it to an assembly line, which may seem a little heartless, but in fact, it creates the possibility for very poor people to have eye operations or heart operations, and without any loss in quality, because the surgeon is so experienced, having done so many operations, that they can do it very fast and fairly automatically. I think you see that in logistics. You mentioned distribution. Indian real estate prices in the middle of a big city, very high. If I want to build a big mall, big shop, I start off with a high fixed cost. If I can make it a virtual shop, I can access a lot of urban population, but also a lot of population in really small towns. And increasingly, we see a lot of goods being ordered by those people. They have choice, they have variety that they didn't have before. And the key is to make the cost of logistics in getting the stuff to them really low. So absolutely, I think technology will play a big part. In terms of management support, in terms of utilizing the enormous information that is being created, that is starting to happen. In fact, we have peer-to-peer networks starting up. We're watching them, we're trying to understand them, but trying to base it on information collected about a person's paying habits. I think
there's a question right in the front row here.
Hi, I'm Ashish Goyal. I'm a global macro investor. Thank you, Governor Rajan. You touched upon technology and productivity. I've been thinking about this, whether technological innovation and in services and manufacturing affect productivity and growth very differently in a sustainable format, and whether there are phases in the world in the last few years where whenever technological innovation has happened in manufacturing, you've seen sustainable growth for a while, and then that's petered off. And what you're seeing now is a massive move in services versus manufacturing. So would you have some thoughts on that?
I'm not sure where you're going with the. I mean, are you saying that?
I'm saying that if there was more technological innovation in manufacturing, which was game changing, versus what's happening now in services, which is much more material, would that lead to better productivity and better growth, or at a
I
system?
think. Um, okay, let me phrase your question this way: that it seems to me that technological innovation in manufacturing is perhaps, modulo that point about quality that I made earlier, perhaps more measurable than technological innovation in services. We've had a tremendous improvement in some cases. Some people would argue airline service has gone down over time, but certainly we're getting much cheaper tickets. But it's very hard to measure service quality. Much easier to measure manufacturing numbers, and to some extent a little easier perhaps measuring manufacturing quality. So your point may be that productivity in manufacturing is easier to measure. Productivity in services is lost in the noise, and therefore productivity growth in manufacturing may actually show up. Maybe right.
Question on the side here.
Amlan Roy from Credit Suisse. Thanks, Raghu, for a very interesting talk. I go back to the quality question as a global researcher. Over the last 40, 50 years since the system of national accounts was developed, we still have problems which Bill Gross of PIMCO talks about, you mentioned Marty, that we've been grappling with, of quality measurement in productivity, but also the GDP deflator. If you look at the GDP deflator of India compared to China, it's very different, US over the last few years. How do you see the investments we've not done in improving data? Because there's GDP data revision, inflation, and lots of other problems. I don't think we've invested a lot in improving the quality of data as macroeconomists and finance people. My second quick take is also that monetary policy, I believe, has failed, but we need integrated fiscal and monetary policy, as Krugman, Kocher-Lakota, and as well as Taylor say. And on the last point, I disagree with you on the fact that global aging is not understood. Since 1996, I think we've made some progress since Bakshi and Chen, Nishimura, et cetera, on understanding.
Okay, that's quite cheeky. That's 3 questions.
Right. In reverse order, yeah, I mean, look, you're more of an expert on global aging than I am, and you probably understand it much better than I do. It's more the macroeconomic effects to me. I mean, the studies I've seen are not that clear as to why, for example, it would describe the low investment environment that we have today as well. But happy to be educated on that. The second point you made was combined fiscal and monetary. Perhaps bringing them both together at the same time might work. But I worry that, when people keep saying we have more room, I think in some countries we don't have that much room. And certainly the room we have with debt to GDP at 100% is probably lower than the room we had when it was 70%. So how much room do we have to continue experimenting? And at what point does this create more anxiety than necessarily good? One thing I will say that in all this talk of fiscal stimulus, you rarely see the specific project, the specific rate of return thing that will be funded. Instead, there's a vague statement about let's spend more and somehow it will help. And I think that we need to get more real. What is it that you want to spend on? And once you have that, you can make an assessment. I think perhaps the statement Keynes made that had the most grievous effect was that you can get growth by digging up holes and filling them up again. And I think I don't think he intended that. I've seen some dialogue about whether that was in fact what he intended. But I think people have taken that and run with it and said, doesn't matter what you spend on, just spend. And clearly there are situations where a significant negative NPV investment or spending would create much more problems for the economy and much less positive sentiment than a positive. So if there are great projects, by all means, we should fund them and spend. But we always talk in the hypothetical, and then when you get down to it, what is it? High-speed rail. Well, so that's, and to the first point was measurement. Obviously, we need better measurement. Perhaps all this use of big data and so on, we're ourselves exploring big data and seeing how it can allow us to get a better sense of prices. But you're right, across the world, there are questions about GDP measurement. But central bankers don't really look at one number and this thing and make a judgment on that basis. We look at a whole range of things. And yes, sometimes it's your feel for it. Does it really feel that things are getting better or getting worse, rather than was it 7.6 or 7.5?
Just to follow up on one thing you just said, which is the sort of slightly naive aspect. Some people can just say, spend some more money, and they don't talk about the project. A slightly more sophisticated thing at the moment, comments which are made at the moment, is spend money on infrastructure, because not only do you create demand, but you create new supply. Right. Does that suffer from the same critique, that you actually have to name the project rather than just saying infrastructure is a good thing?
I think there's a whole range of infrastructure. And so the question is, what do you have in mind? Because anything broadly comes within that label. And there are issues of who plans it, who makes decisions about road from where to where or bridge from where to where, who funds it, who supervises the construction, all of which are things that if you did it carefully would take time. There are lots of projects buried in drawers. What is it? Shelf-ready projects, whatever they call it.
Shovel-ready.
Shelf? Shovel-ready projects. But the shovel-ready projects often are projects you buried because you really didn't think they were worth funding unless somebody else was coming to put up the money. And I know when I see projects in the city of Chicago, that what gets paid for and done when there's federal money available is quite different from what gets paid and done when you have to use local dollars. So I think there is an issue of implementation which needs to be thought about. I'm all for building a pipeline of genuine positive NPV shovel-ready projects in good times, so that you can pull them out in bad times. Okay, I won't do this now because costs are a little higher, real interest rates are a little higher. Let them come down. This becomes viable at that point. That's fine, but I don't think that's what we have in the drawers right now.
Great. So in the third row, yes, gentleman.
Good morning. My name is Dmitry Tsvetkov. I'm an alumni from EXP18. One of the things which I don't think are captured and measured accurately is corruption. A few days ago, there was a mini scandal here in London when Premier Cameron spoke to the Queen and mentioned a couple of countries with a high level of corruption. And suddenly people thought that he was making a mistake and he should have apologized. Actually, I don't believe he should have apologized. I think truth is truth, and there are many countries, primarily developing countries, which have corruption as a big issue. So from your perspective, India, how important the issue of corruption is, how to deal with it, and whether there is an opinion that corruption is something which is cultural and it's difficult to deal with and it will never be eradicated. So what's your views, how important it is, and where it is in terms of priorities for the government of India?
First, I think it is an important tax on the system, which impedes good decision making, impedes economic growth. I don't think it's necessarily cultural. I mean, there are certain aspects of what one might call corruption in one culture, which is not seen as corruption in others. But I don't think this idea of I will do the wrong project if you pay me enough money is something that any society welcomes or thinks as appropriate behavior. And I think there's a very strong upsurge against corruption in India. We have a very sort of free press which tries to unearth some of these instances. We have a public which is fed up with the petty corruption. I think the government has taken a number of steps to increase transparency in contracts, in allocations. This has been a process over the last few years, and I think we are in a much better place than we used to be. So the grand level corruption probably has diminished somewhat. Has corruption been entirely extinguished? Absolutely not. There's a lot of work that we need to do. I think technology helps. I think as, for example, we've moved into railway ticketing through automatic net tickets, the corruption in allocating railway tickets came down substantially, and touts no longer sort of squeezed all the supply and sold it separately. Income tax has been automated. You don't have to go to the income tax inspector to get your money back. There's an automatic, in fact, I find easier to file income tax in India than filing my US income tax. So there are places where we have been tackling this, more way to go. And there are examples of countries that have tackled corruption very effectively, and we need to learn from them. Singapore is one example. At the same time, let me also stress that the fight against corruption doesn't begin and end in the developing countries. It also requires the support of countries like the United Kingdom and the United States. A lot of money that's taken out shows up somehow in places like, like London or in places elsewhere. And therefore, I think the moves on trying to identify beneficial ownership and making sure that money that was taken illegally out or money that is evading taxes is brought to justice. I think that's extremely important, and I think we need the full support of industrial country governments to make that happen. I'm glad that international cooperation is emerging on this, but I think countries need to walk the talk on this. And it's not just emerging markets that are part of the solution. Industrial countries are part of the solution on containing corruption.
Woman in front row.
Hello, Ala from BNP Paribas. My question is, why has the sovereign decided to stay away from debt capital markets? And what would be the catalyst for the sovereign to consider that? Because we see your corporates and your banks coming to market. So what would be the catalyst for the sovereign?
Well, the sovereign is in the market every week in a big way. It's just that they're in the rupee market. And I see no reason for the sovereign to issue dollar bonds across the world. Sovereigns would love to borrow in their own currency. When the Indian government can borrow freely and long term, the average maturity now of government debt is nearing 10 years. If you can borrow freely long term in domestic currency, there's absolutely no reason for it to go out and start a dollar borrowing program. I just think we'll continue borrowing in our own currency, and I've resisted every attempt for somebody to sell me on a global dollar bond. Doesn't make any sense for us.
Gentleman in the third row here.
Hi, Girish, EXP 19. Raghu, there was a recent campaign in India on Make in India, I think fairly successful. I just want your views on it, whether this will achieve the purpose in the long run, or do you think an additional government or an economic stimulus should be provided for more R&D, for us to compete or for India to compete more, in the global marketplace?
I think Make in India is a nice descriptor of a range of activities that are taking place to make India a better place to produce in. Whether it's the production of manufactured goods or services. So it involves things like improving the infrastructure, involves things like bringing down excessive regulation, competition between the states on things like doing business, the ease of doing business and making it easier. So I think it allows a quick descriptor of a range of things that are necessary to make India a more friendly place to do business. Amongst the things we need to do is improve the quality of R&D. Of course, there are foreign institutions that have come and set up R&D sort of offices in Bangalore and Hyderabad. We need to encourage that. But we also need to encourage domestic R&D, joint ventures, defense ventures, etc. So I think that there are attempts to increase that. One of the things we've been working very hard on is creating a predictable tax structure. And of course, every time we talk about taxes, we get Vodafone sort of flung back at us. The Vodafone case, remember, Vodafone has still to pay a single naya paisa on the demands that were levied on it. That's going on. We have a structure of how this is decided, and I think the government has said repeatedly, we can't subvert that structure for a specific case. But going forward, we will try and make the tax regime as transparent and as clear to you as possible, and I think that effort is underway. So there are now advanced tax rulings that you can get from the tax authorities. So across the board, the attempt is to make India a better place to produce in.
Well, I'm really sorry. We have actually just run out of time, and I was under very strict instructions to close it down at 9:30. Raghu's going to be just hanging about a bit at the end, I think. I'd just like to say, on behalf of everyone in here, thank you very much. It was extremely informative and stimulating and candid discussion.